Beer Sports in the northwest treasures every moment with her 8-year-old son.
Well, he suffers from a rare disease and lives now on borrowed time.
Jean du Plessis looks like any other 8-year-old, but his future is uncertain. Diagnosed with Pompe disease at the age of 11 months, for which there is no cure, he lacks an enzyme which breaks down glucose. This sugar builds up in his muscles and causes weakness, heart problems and breathing difficulties.
We have on average 24 doctor's appointments scheduled a year in the form of cardiology, endocrinology, neurology, etc. We have lots of blood tests and scans, but most importantly is the enzyme replacement therapy which he gets, which is basically his life-saving drug, and he gets that into his veins every second week, and it's a 6-hour process for us to do that infusion. But it's become a way of life for us, and that drug has essentially given him a lease at life.
For a disease to be rare, it has to affect less than 1 in every 2,000 people. Pompe disease affects 1 in about 40,000. Currently, there are only 8 diagnosed sufferers in South Africa. A lonely journey for these patients and their parents. Jean's mother established Rare Diseases South Africa to reach out.
One of the major challenges in South Africa is accessing high-priced drugs, which are generally the treatment for these rare conditions. And I think in terms of support as well, we connect patients with one another. We put them in touch with other families sharing similar challenges. And I think when you're being faced by a condition that's so unknown and there's so little awareness, to just know that you've got somebody else in similar shoes kind of makes it a little bit like you feel like you can deal with it. So it provides a coping mechanism.
Doctors advised Jean's parents to make his first birthday extra special, saying he wouldn't celebrate a second. Only time will tell what age Jean will reach. But like any other child, he dreams of what to do if he grows up.
That's very easy.
What?
I've been talking around so much, and that's a snake catcher.
Rare Diseases South Africa has 1,065 registered patients, with 613 different rare diseases. Sufferers and their families have formed 228 support groups. Nicolene Smalman, SABC News, Hartbeespoort Dam.
The mother of the Northern Cape boy, Kutlwano Kharisape, who was murdered 2 years ago, says that she has made peace with his brutal killing.
Kutlwano's mother says her son died a hero after he saved her from a would-be rapist. The 6-year-old's body was then dumped on a railway line near Jan Kempdorp after his murder.
Kutlwano met his untimely death on the railway line like this one. The young boy bravely defended his mother in a scuffle that lasted almost half an hour. His killer, 30-year-old Tefilo Dikole, has been found guilty of murder and attempted rape. Dikole stabbed him to death with a bottle, but it took almost 2 years before Dikole could be successfully convicted.
In the premise, I'm satisfied that the state has succeeded in proving its case beyond reasonable doubt in respect of both counts. Accordingly, I find you guilty in respect of the following. Count 1, attempted rape. Count 2, murder.
Kutlwano's mother says she is relieved that justice has been served, but has called on government to do more to protect the safety and lives of children.
After 3 years attending to the case, it seemed there was no progress, but we thank God we are happy that our journey is coming to an end. There are many kids suffering and experiencing challenges like the one I'm coming from. Though it takes time, we receive help.
Meanwhile, Childline says more needs to be done to protect children.
It's an area of concern. As you know, that as different service providers like Childline will be offering our counseling services to these children or the victims, but it ends there. Then from there, then we depend on our law enforcement agencies to continue their work. So we depend solely and 100% on them.
Kutlwano's mother has called on communities to support child safety campaigns.
The community should protect our children. If you realize that you cannot find your child and you do not know how long your child has been gone, you should not be at peace and you ought to know where your child is.
Kutlwano's convicted killer will be sentenced next week at the Kimberley High Court. Keith Seister, SABC News, and Kempdorp, Northern Cape.
Now, as we mark Child Protection Week, stats released in Parliament show that at least 41% of all reported rape cases in the past 3 years involved children, and in the same period, more than 2,000 children were murdered. Despite our sophisticated legal framework, South Africa is still marked by high levels of violence against and exploitation of children. Now, to speak to us some more, we're now joined on the line by Mufaro Magidi, who's the operations manager at Mosaic, which is a non-profit organization focused on the prevention and reducing abuse and domestic violence, especially for women and the youth living in poor communities. Thanks very much for joining us and welcome to the program. And it's a pity that these issues come to the fore. Yeah, it's a pity that these issues come to the fore in a week like this, and yet the trauma is year-long. These statistics are quite alarming. I know that when you formed in 1993, you were focused on women, violence against women. When did you start to see that this is spilling out into children, and do the two go together?
Yeah, so the organization's mandate was, you're quite right, we started off in 1993, and the focus at the time was women, and focusing on violence against women mostly. But it became at that time that violence and issues of abuse, the number one victims still remain to be women and children. And, you know, when violence is happening in households, we realized also that children are mostly affected. So we couldn't at the time ignore, you know, the violence being perpetrated against children, and the stats are quite staggering and disturbing to think of it. And that's how we've now evolved as an organization to say, in as much as we work with women, we also need to factor in that children still make a large cohort of the people that are directly affected by violence in our communities.
All right, so I guess, I mean, you know, we've got a few minutes, but these big issues, what causes the violence and what can we do to prevent it?
Yeah, you see, there are different contributing factors to the people have used, and, you know, research tells us of issues, for instance, in terms of access to services is a bit slow, which in cases like, especially in our rural communities where the police station is 100 kilometers away, we find that those are mitigating factors. There's a lack of education on the different forms of violence, both on the children's side, but then also on caregivers and parents as well. To say there really isn't enough education that speaks to what constitutes violence, and so it's in some cases we actually find that it's ignorance that's happening, and then also with the education part, we've, you know, for years we've focused on telling our children, don't talk to strangers, don't walk out on the streets at night, but we're not educating our children on watch out for Uncle Mufaro who visits the house regularly. So when those things are ignored, we're finding that a lot of the violence keeps going on and it's happening within the households. And there really isn't enough being done to address that as well.
Sexual violence is fairly obvious. It is wrong, and those that are perpetrating it know that it's wrong. But I guess it starts to become a grey area when parents are seemingly disciplining their children. When do they cross the line? When does that become abuse?
Yeah, so it's a very grey area, you know, because we will still get very many parents is sort of like feeling as if the act to protect children from abuse takes away the responsibility to discipline a child. But that's not the case. What we're saying is find constructive means that discipline your child, be it that you take away some privileges, take away toys, things like that, but to actually use physical force. that's where we border on abuse. When you start name calling your child, that's when abuse kicks in. So it's always people try to say it's a gray line, but I think it's very clear and straightforward. And abuse can clearly be identified. If you're name calling your child, if you're using physical force, if it is a measure of discipline, there are some measures and ways that a child can be disciplined without causing harm to the child.
And then when it comes to domestic violence and abuse, it's mostly men, sadly. But I've read a statistic somewhere where it suggests that a child who might have been abused as a child, sexually abused even, may become an abuser later on. So that, we feel sorry for the kid now, but in the years to come, if there's no intervention, we'll be vilifying that same child that's a product of its own violence as in its childhood.
Yeah, no, you're quite right, because what we've seen with abuse is that it almost happens in a cycle, where if someone is abused as a child or is exposed to abuse, where a child is brought up in a household where they are witnessing abuse, that sort of becomes the norm. Where if a child comes home to see the father beating the mother every day, that's the life the child knows. So we shouldn't be surprised when that child grows up to be an abuser, because that's the norm for him. And we still experience a lot of that with the men that we work with as well, that are perpetrators, where we find that a lot of them do detail stories where they've been exposed to abuse during their early childhood years, or they actually grow up saying, but my father did it with my mother, and they stayed happily married for years. So there's almost a justification of, I've seen this happening throughout my life, and it can be justified now. So yes, abuse cascades in many cases, where the very same people that are experiencing abuse now, we have statistics that show that there's a higher chance that they might become perpetrators of abuse themselves. And that is why we're saying children need to be protected, not only from direct abuse themselves, but then exposure of abuse. And that's how we start cutting off the cycle of abuse.
All right, Mufaro, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thanks very much indeed for your insights on this day. That was Mufaro Dean Magidi, who's the operations manager at the NGO Mosaic. And with that, we turn our attention to the world of sport with Pearl.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and a very good afternoon to you. Looking at